Hello neighbor, I'm Robert Burns and welcome once again to another edition of Sound Off Louisiana. And you will recall from our last episode, we took Attorney Phil Price to task for blaming the jury for the outcome of the Stanford victims' trial against the Office of Financial Institutions, or OFI. And at the end of that feature, we mentioned that we would be doing an in-depth coverage of one young lady in particular. Her name is Angela Shaw Alexander, aka Angela Shaw, aka Angela Kogut. And that's what today's feature will focus on. Now, I explained, or we provided in the written part of the prior feature, and briefly stated that, and that's the reason I did it prior to, so not to spend any time on that. She married into a family that, when they sold the business to a firm in Germany, invested close to $4.25–4.5 million into these Stanford International Bank CDs, only to find out on February the 19th of 2009 that they were essentially worthless. So let's talk a little bit about Miss Angela Alexander's background. She spent about 12 years as the communications director, the senior director of public affairs for the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. So I would argue that she might have been able to get a little knowledge about what banks can and can't invest in. Of course, she didn't go out and say, as Mr. Price did, I just don't understand that. He understands, trust me, was former OCC examiner. She may or may not have understood, but I did find it interesting that she spent 12 years as the senior director for public affairs for the Federal Reserve Bank in Dallas. Now we're going to give you a timeline by way of a table of various things that took place in the whole Stanford matter. However, I'll bring your attention to a couple of important dates. First of all, everybody knows, well, you don't know, but you'll see it in the table. On February the 17th of 2009, as I just mentioned, that's when the Fed shut everything down. Well, in the aftermath of that, Miss Angela Shaw Alexander she was the founder and the director of the Stanford Victims Coalition. And on November the 14th of 2010, she drafted a letter to the then president and CEO of the SIPC. And we're going to give you a link for that letter, but I want to read something from that letter. Just give me 1 second to pull it up. We're going to read just the introduction. Now that letter was dated, as I said, September 14th of 2010, and it's addressed to Mr. Stephen Harbeck, who was the then president and CEO of the SIPC, Securities Investment Protection Corporation. She begins out by saying, "Dear Mr. Harbeck, I was very surprised to see this statement from you in Kathy Christoph's Los Angeles Times article on Sunday." So this was a very recent article. Quote, now this is the president and CEO, the director and CEO, actually I had it right, president and CEO of the SIPC, Securities Investors Protection Corporation. And this is his quote, and she's quoting him verbatim. "The investors in Stanford Financial Group are holding the certificates of deposit in a bank in Antigua in their hands. We do not protect fraudulent projections of value. We ensure that investors receive the securities that they bought, and they have them." All right. Now, Miss Alexander chose to use some pretty terse wording regarding his statement in that regard, and you're welcome to read it. But one of the biggest reasons I'm doing this feature is I have some friends that are exceptionally intelligent regarding financial markets and whatnot, and they have admitted to me that they were unaware that SIPC did not cover this sort of thing. The SIPC, as I emphasized in one of the features during this whole Stanford matter, It covers the existence of securities. The reason that the Madoff victims did get coverage and these folks didn't is that Madoff actually had a better Ponzi scheme than Mr. Stanford. Mr. Stanford's was always vulnerable to a liquidity crunch because these things are piling up in these real estate assets, which Ms. Van Tassel testified to as being overvalued, but he didn't have anything he could readily liquidate. Madoff was much smarter. He had a lot of common stocks in these accounts, and if redemption started to come in more than he expected, what would he do? He would go into one of these accounts and simply decide, all right, I'm selling this old boy's stock, okay, or this young lady's stock. The funds have gone missing. I'm sorry, the securities have gone missing. And Madoff also very critically, for these folk, there was no online access to your account. That was critical to him maintaining it. But I draw that distinction because that is exactly what SIPC covers. When an entity is about to go insolvent, when in Stanford's case it was apparently insolvent for 8 years, you cannot go in and help yourself to securities that you're merely holding for the benefit of the account holders. That's what it covers. Madoff did that. If he had redemptions running too high, he would sell some stock from this holder or that holder, and then the next thing you know, the statements that they got were you had purchased the stock, but hey, look, I needed it to meet some redemption, so you really don't have it anymore. That's why it was covered in Madoff. In sharp contrast, you just heard him say they have the CDs in their hands. Now, and we're going to give you a link from the SIPC's webpage, which will state very, very clearly what is covered, because I want everybody, if you take nothing else from this whole Stanford matter, to know that when you see that SIPC coverage, whether it be Merrill Lynch or whoever, you need to have an understanding of what it covers. Now, Miss Alexander, she said that in one of her statements, perhaps in that letter, I don't know, because we're going to get to the fact. Oh, by the way, she also gave testimony to the United States Congress on November the 21st of 2013, and that'll be in that table, and there's a direct link. You can look at her verbatim testimony. You can look at all of the exhibits, one of which was the letter I just mentioned to you, but it's so duplicative duplicative of our prior feature where we explained how they lost the money, the Kogut family. She was then a Kogut. But my point is, she wants to say nobody else can comprehend what we've been through. Nobody else will ever understand this. No, it's not very difficult to understand that. And does she really think that this is the only instance in which people have been defrauded that made investments? What about WorldCom? What about Enron? And those situations are far worse because those were not restricted to just accredited investors, i.e. those that had at least $1 million net worth or $200,000 income, $300,000 if you're married. Those investments were out there for the general public to have bought. And yet, what happened? Accounting fraud sank WorldCom. Accounting fraud sank Enron. I explained the accounting fraud that was going on here. Ms. Van Tassel actually explained it, and I basically re-emphasized what she said. You never saw any clamoring for coverage of WorldCom. Why? Because it's not covered. It was accounting fraud that wiped it out. Enron, accounting fraud wiped it out. There's been accounting fraud in a number of other companies that have literally caused it to cease to exist. It is not covered by SIPC. Those WorldCom owners of that stock, they had their shares. They had their shares. Enron, they had their shares. The securities did not go missing. They were not misappropriated. There was no coverage. There's no coverage for worthless securities, even if they are purchased at the outset and turn out to be worthless. So I really want to drive that point home, because I know there was a lack of comprehension of this on the part of many of the Stanford investors, but I'm more so concerned that even some seasoned folk that I would have probably figured knew this didn't. And they say, well, how do you know it? Well, I've devoted my whole life to this, okay? It began when I was 8 years old and I saw my father looking at the newspaper, particularly the stock section, and that's how I chose my own major as finance at LSU. I did concentrate on commercial banking because it certainly makes getting a job easier, although it was difficult in the mid-'80s, which is when I graduated. But my whole life has been devoted to this. So, you know, I'm going to have a crystal clear understanding of what is covered by SIPC coverage and what is not. And in us giving you that link, it will spell it out clearly. And Mr. Harbeck explained it very clearly as to why there was no coverage by the SIPC. Now, Ms. Alexander chose to say, well, our securities were stolen, which tells, our funds were stolen and the securities were fictitious and all of that. You'll see all of that if you choose to read the letter that she wrote to the SIPC president and CEO. But no, Channel 2 actually videoed actual CDs. These folks had these CDs, but what it tells me is she knew, okay? She knew. So she was trying to explain away why we should get coverage. And that's in that letter. Now, in her testimony, which you're welcome to see the whole, read it all, she's going around the world there too to try to explain why these things should be covered. I'm going to be perfectly blunt with you. I was a strong supporter of David Vitter for governor in 2015, but that was absolutely inexcusable. Convincing the SIPC, and it wasn't just, there was a lot of political pressure put on them by the SEC, who ironically had blundered this whole thing. And we're going to, in that timeline, we'll give you these dates. And so the SIPC decided to cave, and they offered $250,000 to each account holder, up to $250,000 for the loss. That was resoundingly rejected. There are blogs out there that will show you this that have since ceased to exist, but it still got, when the Google crawlers would capture it before, you can see in the headlines that it was resoundingly rejected by the Stanford victims. The SEC also said, no, that's not enough. Well, you got to figure the people who had the influence for the SEC to have said no would be people like Miss Alexander's family that had massively more than $500,000 in coverage, which is the limit of SIPC coverage. But the SIPC caved to political pressure and offered the $250,000. It infuriated me because you're setting precedent. If you're going to do that, then the next WorldCom that comes along, what are you going to say? Same circumstances, but, you know, we're not going to, when the next Enron comes, once you open that up. But at any rate, the investors rejected it, the SEC rejected it, and so the SEC sued. And we've got the time frame on there, December of 2011. And then in June of 2012, the judge ruled that no, there is no coverage here. The SEC appealed that, and I believe in 2014, don't hold me to that date, it's in the table. Not the First Circuit, the Washington, D.C. Federal Court Circuit sided with the judge, and then the SEC threw in the towel, and they abandoned trying to recoup SIPC funds for the investors. So folks, thank you so much for your dedicated viewership of Sound Off Louisiana, and we hope everyone enjoys a nice, although hot, weekend. We'll see you next time. Thank you again.